the stress of solving the problems, and that's additional stress and an additional, potential for harm. And so I really started to feel like there was just this intense stress that's happening on this community that's already very stressed, and seeing, friend after friend say, I'm so isolated. I don't have anyone who understands. And so I started asking people about PTSD.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a really interesting process. While I was kind of uncovering those symptoms in myself, I was trying to uncover them in my communities. And one of the major symptoms of PTSD is avoidance.
Mm-hmm.
And so I would often get these responses from moms, and I dealt primarily with moms
mm-hmm.
in this research, this round of research, but I would get a mom who would say, yes, I totally have PTSD. I'd love to talk to you about it. And I would message her, and maybe she'd respond, maybe she wouldn't. But eventually, oftentimes, the person would just kind of disappear.
Uh-huh.
And be non-responsive.
Mm-hmm.
And at first I thought, well, we all have complicated kids, and, who knows what's going on. But it happened time and time and time again,
mm-hmm.
up to and including people saying that they really wanted to participate. But then when we would start talking about it, saying, oh, I don't want to talk about this. I can't talk about this. And so the fact that this is so difficult to talk about indicates a really big problem. But how do you talk about the problem if you can't talk about it?
Yes.
And so at that point, I decided, I had wanted this to be sort of a very clean cut, research reported piece. And at that point, I talked to my editor and said, I'm intimately involved in this. And if I'm going to ask people to talk about these very, very difficult symptoms, I think I need to put mine out there. And so that was the point at which we decided to share my story as well as a part of it in in acknowledgement
mm-hmm.
of the fact that I was asking a lot of people. And I think once I had a handful of people who were really ready and willing to talk, I do think that my willingness to share my own experiences helped them know that they weren't walking out on a ledge by themselves.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I can relate to that. In doing this podcast, I'm talking to moms and asking them to walk through different aspects of their experience with tuberous sclerosis. And it's any disease, there's just so many different aspects of it. I'm bringing up and at the same time, I'm remembering when my own kids are going through these traumas and then keeping that in a container and being able to walk away from it. And I was finding that, myself being triggered quite a bit and having to move in and out of it, but also realizing just the incredible need to talk, to just have somebody listen to you talk mm-hmm. about this, what you're going through, and validate it. So
absolutely.
Yes.
And I think we lack some of the language to talk about it. So, for instance, I had, and still occasionally do have flashbacks. They're
mm-hmm.
not as common as they used to be. But I can remember early on in my writing about it as time travel. And because I would see a baby, and it was always like brand new babies with Esmé had this beautiful full head of hair from birth. And so when I would see a baby with a full head of hair, very often, I would flash back to walking through the doors of the ER with Esmé blue in my arms. And I would smell the air, really strong flashbacks, but I didn't have the language to really understand what that was.
Mm-hmm.
So I had sort of like a narrative language because of my background.
Right.
So it's time travel. If you were writing it as a story, it would be time travel. So
that's a great
term. And I don't think that it's really only very recently that I understood, no, that's a flashback that's what they're talking about when they talk about flashbacks.
Yeah, the notion of PTSD has been so, correlated with military and those types of traumas that,
mm-hmm.
yeah.
Yep.
It started to make sense when I thought about
And I think that correlation with military trauma is also really important and something that came up in a lot of my discussions in the research, which I think a lot of the parents were hesitant to talk in terms of PTSD. They were uncomfortable with that terminology because of the association with military service and specifically with combat. And I think even in the response that I've seen in the weeks since the story came out, I'm seeing a lot of people share it and say, I never felt comfortable talking about this because I was told, this is a thing that veterans have, or I always assumed it was just a thing that veterans have.
Right.
And now I feel like I can talk about it.
Yes.
And what's incredibly interesting, if you read the reported feature, is that there is research that shows, now while there is essentially zero research on the specific population I was looking at, which is parents of children who are both medically fragile and developmentally delayed, who have a sort of a higher baseline stress level because of the developmental challenges, and then peaks and valleys in addition of medical challenges, which I think is a really complex and entirely unstudied population. There are some studies done in either or, including a study in moms of children with autism spectrum disorder that show that their stress hormone levels, their cortisol levels, are consistent with those of combat veterans. So
I did read that in your article.
Physiologically, they are having a response that is very similar to the veteran population. And the limited conversations that I've had, and I hope to have more with veterans, have included conversations about this. And I think it's very intriguing to me that the veterans I've spoken to have been very, very careful to say, no, of course this is a thing. And of course it isn't just people who've seen active duty that should be aware of these symptoms. And very, very, very supportive response from the veterans I've spoken to.
Good. That makes it easier.
Yes.
Yeah, I think there's like this I know you know this, the concept that, oh my goodness, well, the veterans have this. How could I possibly be dealing with anything because I didn't go to war? I mean, I'm just sitting at home with my kid. Right. So, yeah. You start to conceive of the article for the research for your article, and you decide to come out with your story. And then how did you go about getting these moms how did you find the people that were included in your article, and how did you go about that process of research?
So I'm a part of a lot of different online communities, especially. And so I kind of put a bunch of feelers out and spoke to a lot of different moms who were interested, some of whom I hope to move forward with in a more in-depth interview, and who I wasn't able to. Also, we had to consider where we could get photographers because we knew we wanted it to be a highly visual display as well. And really, it just was a matter of, the people who kind of kept talking to me. I spoke to probably 20 moms in some degree of depth via email or online, and then narrowed it down to the 5 that were sort of actively engaged and met some of the criteria that I was looking for, by way of diversity in diagnosis and location and all of that.
So you got a spectrum.
Experience. I wanted to have a spectrum of people. And at that point, I had lengthy interviews with the 5 moms who were included in the phone interviews with the 5 moms who were included in the series. But it was really, it was probably dozens of people that I surveyed over a period of probably 6 months from when I started pursuing it sort of casually.
Wow. Was that, did you find that to be trigger? Now, I hate to use the word trigger because it's so overused, but, was that, I'm sure it was painful for you to walk through that with people.
Yeah. It seems entirely unprofessional or unreporterly to admit, but it's true. I cried during every single one of those interviews.
I watched your
everything.
video. Yeah, I teared up a little watching some of the things that you had posted and the article. Yeah, it's painful. It's
It
painful.
is. It's
There's no way around it.
there is no way around it, and it's a lot of the response I've received have been, a lot of parents saying, like, I hear my story in every one of these stories. And I
Yes.
think that's really so true for me. Each one of those moms said things, that rang so true to me. The one that stands out at this moment is, Faria saying, for 3 years, I've spent every day talking to a person who doesn't talk back to me, and talking about how in some ways for her that's been more difficult than the seizures, than the challenges that her son faces medically, because it is really challenging to spend your days like that, and nobody who isn't in that position can fully understand what that feels like, to have that kind of relationship with your child. And then she said, but I do it because I want him to know that there's someone ready to talk to him when he can, and even if he never can, that there's someone who still
he's in there,
wants to speak with him.
Yeah.
And that's, rings very true to my experience with Esmé. She'll be 8, and occasionally she has said words and they disappear. But we've never had a conversation.
Wow.
A verbal conversation. We have lots of physical conversations. We touch each other. We hold each other. We roll, she rolls her eyes at me, all of that good stuff. But, I can't ask her what she dreamt about last night, or if she likes her teacher, and who her favorite friend is at school. And, she has her ways of telling me those things, and I think it's a really hard concept for someone who hasn't experienced that day in and day out to understand
absolutely
the job of telling someone who cannot speak that their opinions, their views on the world are important, and that you are going to work your hardest to access them.
That's huge. It's a monumental challenge, and I know it's in the TSC communities. There's such a wide range of how people are affected that there's a lot of parents that could relate to that type of experience, while at the other extreme So I personally, my kids have been able to speak, that we've had other issues, but I can't relate to that. That sounds very, very challenging. And so there's just so many different aspects of this so where do you go from here? This article's come out, and you really kind of are starting to peel back the layers of meaning and impact, and what's next, and what have you learned as far as how people cope, how you cope, however you want to take this?
Yeah. So I think there's a lot of takeaway.
What people can do, kind of. And
for myself, the way that I have coped, speaking very personally, is this is how I cope, right? I write, I advocate, and I think that, a lot of coping techniques in this community have to be very creative, because I think there are a lot of barriers for these parents to seek the kinds of help that you might seek if you were in a terrible car accident and you could take the time to go and see a therapist. You could, risk the side effects of taking medications. A lot of parents can't physically get out of the house. A good day is taking a shower, to seek the kinds of, I think most people in our community
that they need.
Right. Can recognize, when people say, like, oh, well, make sure you're taking time for yourself. I'm like, yeah, that's me peeing alone. Like, that's the time I have for myself. So, and also there's a lot of fear around, using medications that might, inhibit someone's ability to be responsive to their child. And then also I think that at the core, some of the responses to stress are actually adaptive. So, the line between what's hypervigilance and just good vigilance is blurry. And so I think the takeaway is that I think there's so much that we just don't know about how people are responding to these situations, and
Oh,
that
boy.
there's a real need for there to